Well, hello, and here we are once again. Welcome from the city of Detroit, north of Detroit, actually, but I come from Detroit. I was born there in a hospital that was built by my great-grandfather on my mother's side. His company built it. And so I remember Detroit when it was called the Paris of the Midwest. And I'm here with Reverend David William Parry in the city of London in oft-times merry old England. And this is What is Truth, episode 89, where we have the audacity to try and approach a subject that continually recedes. How you doing there, David?
Good afternoon, John. Always a pleasure. No matter where you're from, always a pleasure. My hair is getting wilder. I'm less like Friar Tuck, or indeed Benjamin Franklin, which is my aim, and more like the wild man of Borneo at the moment. I'm hot, even though the temperatures are much better than they were, and a little sort of splattered around the edges, but okay. Enjoying the internal leadership election of the Conservative Party in the UK to see who will be our new Prime Minister. Of course, they weren't voted for. Lucky old us. But we will soon have one, that bizarre woman, all sort of the Oriental accountant, very, very soon. And what lucky people we are with this vast array of competent, caring public servants. I am thrilled to be in merry old England. Yourself, John?
Yeah, well, there's, as always is the case, there's more than one way to look at it, and I guess that's what keeps it interesting. Today is what, July 20, excuse me, July 24th, and what, in your country in 1567, Mary Queen of Scots was forced to abdicate and replaced by her one-year-old son, James VI, on the throne of Scotland. He ended up becoming James I, King of England and Scotland and Ireland and, all things British, so to speak. And he's an interesting character. He was referred to, and you hear the reference frequently, he was referred to as the wisest fool in Christendom. And it's a label that's usually attributed to Henry IV of France, who's an interesting character himself. That's like good King Henry, Henry the Great. He's King of Navarre from 1572 and King of France from 1589 to 1610. But that label, it seems some scholars think was possibly coined by Anthony Weldon, and because it catches his style, so to speak. But he said, a very wise man was wont to say that he believed him the wisest fool in Christendom, meaning him wise in small things, but a fool in weighty affairs. So that gives you some food for thought. James I, of course, being of the King James Bible fame. And so he's quite an amazing character, highly educated by Buchanan, who was basically watched over him as he was growing up and was his tutor. And so James was thoroughly conversant in ancient languages, Latin and Greek, and even knew Hebrew somewhat, so when you get somebody that's capable of grasping that measure of detail, that's unique. And in that, if you look at the superficial proofs that seem to occupy positions of authority today, I think David would agree with me on that, is it's a mixed bag. And so when you look at these things, because it's very easy to do research about a figure like James I and come up with an opinion like Reverend David's opinion, that he doesn't care for them. He thinks that they're like the worst. But you have to look at these things in terms of time. What time was it? And that was before 1879, with the birth of the Age of Michael. That'll go for another 300-400 years. But the previous period of relative length of the Age of Gabriel, it was appropriate to have this kind of rulership through ancestral ruling houses and all of that. But we're out of the nursery now, and so we have to stand with the big boys and girls and try to individuate and be bereft of all the appurtenances, shall we say, that have come with this whole anointing of individuals to be in charge of the welfare of mankind.
I've nothing against kings and queens, provided we can all be kings and queens. Why is it all of my American friends love royalty? Can you have them? You know, goodbye, right, you go off to America now. You have them, and we'll do well without them in our new democracy. I think that's a sterling idea. No matter what the metaphysics behind it, no matter what the great and the gay are saying, you know, I've got a Monty Python attitude to it. You know, what was it in? I can't remember which movie it was in, where basically you've got Michael Palin as the peasant, with one of the other Pythons as his mother, and they're talking about a mandate for supreme executive power, and you get the King Arthur riding up, and he says he was chosen by the Lady of the Lake. I'm paraphrasing terribly, sorry guys. And Michael Palin says, look, supreme executive power isn't derived from some sort of aquatic ritual. You know, I mean, I'm sorry, there we are. Is there an infancy for humanity? I'm sure there is, and we're still in it. You know, my brother's bigger than your brother. I mean, certainly the history of kingship is very, very interesting. There was a time, of course, when the king really was first amongst equals, and the king's friend, who would accompany the king everywhere, was not a servant. He was an assistant, a companion. And that went, of course, with the arrival of the Normans, who were bastards. You know, and it withers away, and it becomes more.
You're picking on my family now.
Yeah, but they gave birth to such beautiful offspring. You know, that I think ancestor worship is a very, very required taste. It's a very acquired taste. Yeah, I mean, you know, are we simply the sum of our family parts? Of course not. Are we? You know what? No, I don't. I just can't stand all of this nonsense. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, as the old Fabians used to say. You know, there's another favourite of mine. What was it? A golf club stands beside the mill, and on a sunny day, the little children at their work can see the men at play. No, sod the lot of them. Goodbye, you've had your stint. Yes, John.
Well, you know, you mentioned golf, and that's the ultimate Scottish sport. And actually that word is an anagram. Gentlemen only, ladies forbidden. And so that's an interesting thing. And at that time, there was a definite strong awareness of the distinction between the roles of the male and female. You know, it was something that was a part of the fabric of society, and it's a part that they're trying to, you know, like blow away entirely today with the kind of narrative going around. And you have to go, well, what is that? But below in the text that I've inserted beneath the video here on YouTube. Of course, if you're on Twitter, you're going to have to go over to YouTube to see it, obviously. But down there is listed a lecture cycle that it was one of the two, I believe, lecture cycles that Rudolf Steiner actually took the time to go back and edit it into a book form. And so it's I think, critically important if you want to gain an understanding of Rudolf Steiner's view on the relationship of the mystery of Jesus Christ to Earth evolution. But in there, he shows the divine forces working within early childhood, and that's covered in the first of the three lectures. There's three lectures, and then there's a fourth part that was added to it. It's uncertain the provenance of that fourth part that's inserted in the back of the book, but nonetheless, in there, Rudolf Steiner describes how these beings of a very exalted nature participate in the development of the child up to when the child learns to have self-reference and realize everybody has a point that if you remember back, that you can't seem to get beyond in your memory. And that is the bridge. But that has to do with the idea that's pointed at by Jesus when he says, "Except ye be as little children, ye shall not enter the kingdom." And of course, referring to the kingdom of heaven. And so that's a real riddle. And what does that mean? But Rudolf Steiner is very clear when he says, well, personally, and I'm paraphrasing, that if were you to just all of a sudden enter into a relationship with the types of beings that were participating in that stage of development, you would be absolutely overwhelmed by it. It would be a shattering experience because you don't have the developed vehicle to be able to withstand the depth and power of what you would experience. And so you go, well, okay, well, what is that? And that's when you get into the distinction between like somebody who's like kind of a self-made mystic and they have genuine experiences. It's just that they're not necessarily equipped to be able to understand what's happening. And so what one tends to do in that type of a situation is your own thought content is projected into a kind of a visionary tapestry of the experience, and you come out with this subjective relationship to it. And so the distinction between someone like that and someone who's a genuine occultist, like, say, St. Paul, is that they're capable of understanding the process on its own terms. And that's the point that Rudolf Steiner tries to make. For example, when he's doing descriptions of what's called in the Orient, Devachan or Dewachan, as Rinpoche would say, but the heaven world is that Rudolf Steiner talks about people that because they can't get past their own content, their descriptions of these realms, it ends up like a David Chan salon. So it's like they make it like what they're familiar with. In other words, you're going to go up and there's going to be all these virgins, or whatever. So that what the subjective element is present there, and that it requires initiation to be able to go beyond that point, and that enlightenment's just the first step. After enlightenment is that further development to be able to take in the reality of what's going on, and that's of course to the extent that you've been able to unfold your relationship to Christ.
Yeah, where do I begin? There's a lot there. The narrative, or the shattered narrative of the genders, is something that interests me a great deal, not for obvious reasons. As a gay man myself, a gay pastor, I was oh God, revelations on this show. I've probably said it before. I mean, I was originally a member of the Gay Liberation Front, which goes back yonks. There were dinosaurs. Noah was getting out the ark. Yeah. And it was not pretty. I mean, what people were facing in those days, what were we fighting for? Equality before the law, which isn't such a horrendous goal. And my recollections, I was a cub coming up from Fareham in Hampshire in those days to show my solidarity, comrade, and yada yada. My reality, my recollection was being spat at in the face, pushed to the ground, the complete lack of rational discourse if anyone pretended they wanted to actually discuss those things, which they didn't. Pure prejudice reigned and ruled that particular day. And there's a certain sort of romanticization nowadays about that. I think these young whippersnappers who want to relive the 60s and the 70s really need to know what it was like before they decide to go back to that very pressured, right, dare I say it, a pressure cooker of a historical period. Certainly the present gender dialogue, perhaps monologue, doesn't really arise out of that, to my mind. I mean, what we're looking at is something completely different, and it arises out of the Human Genome Project. If you're looking at the serious side of all of this and not just the politics, the way these issues are used by current politicians is disgusting, and it's aimed at creating culture war instead of other types of war. It's genuinely disgusting. And I'm actually quite sort of mellow about that, weirdly. It's a typical case of discovering too much too soon. And, right, so the science is on one level, okay. Half the time, if you read any of the essays, articles they're publishing, they don't seem to know themselves where it's all coming from or where it's all going. Oh, yeah, Rajput, 100% agree. Cultures are destroyed by removing the divine from education, 100% agree. The trouble with that is in what way is the divine inserted into public education? And is public education really public education or some sort of ideology in disguise? That's the trouble with that. Yeah, I mean, I'm from the generation where there used to be prayers at school assembly and people used to sing hymns, and I felt uplifted by the whole thing. I didn't feel indoctrinated. I didn't feel I was having the Bible. Only the American experience might be different. I don't know. The British experience was all rather jolly, and you'd end up planning the cricket game afterwards. So it was my experience was very good, very positive, and you did feel good about the whole thing. It lifted you up a bit. I mean, as I say, my view of the present chaos that's breaking out in gender terms is that you're looking at cultures. I think we're too hard on ourselves in the Anglophone world a lot of the time. Our cultures have actually become incredibly sophisticated, incredibly complex. We should be proud of where we've arrived after centuries of struggle. And not blinded by the skirmish around us. So much has happened that have made a betterment to the human condition. But the trouble is, it takes culture time, any culture, to absorb what the sciences are saying. Excuse me, John. And we simply haven't had the time to work out what does all this mean in terms of the lived experience of endless generations where there were men and there were women, and actually the other genders were acknowledged but seen in different ways. My trouble is, I think politics and politicians, who I think most people know my view of the vast majority of politicians, they seize this discussion for their own ends. They don't allow it to really take place. And they're making enemies amongst people that don't really know what the argument is in the first place. So we've got to be careful. We've got to be careful about what we're condemning and what we're approving. And, you know, I mean, at the risk of sounding disloyal, I mean, as I say, you know, some of my background is Metropolitan Community Church. I mean, St. Valentine's Hall, our St. Valentine's Hall is still very proudly an MCC oasis. We are seen as a community of safety for LGBTQI plus people. We're very proud of that. And okay, the reality is, in terms of bums on seats, in terms of the congregation, as usual, and quite rightly, the heterosexual members of our congregation outnumber the LGBTQI plus members. I mean, what other way could it be? And also, you know, I spent a decade really in pure MCC circles a couple of decades ago. If we're talking about trans people, in a decade I met 2. Therefore, you know, is this really the burning issue? It appears to be. There's fashion and lots of young men liking dressing up as women. I mean, that's not new either. Hasn't anybody ever been to a nightclub? You know, I mean, you know, there is nothing new under the sun. What's happening at the moment, sadly, to my mind, is that politics has got hold of an increasingly fascinating and complex area of life without saying, okay, these are the inherited verities. These are the biological verities we're unearthing. How do these groups of information and facts fit together? That's what I think is happening. And, you know, we've got to get a grip. And the minute people are pitched against each other, I instantly stop looking at the argument and start looking at who's trying to promote the scrap. And it's appalling. I mean, the woke people in this country, it strikes me, couldn't care less, provided they win an election. And I'm not really sure it's different in America. I mean, I don't want to name names. And I think the situation is even more complex in America. But certainly, you know, there are people that spring to mind in the American milieu. They're using these. I mean, they're not divisions. People are they're actually using the word division. They're not divisions. You know, using these insights into the natural order for very nefarious ends. I really wish it would all stop and we could grow up as a species. I mean, partly I blame the whole unwillingness to learn. Why are students unwilling to learn? Because schools, colleges, and now universities are made as boring and sterile as possible for anybody that has the money to go in the first place. Same here nowadays, same as the States, same here. You know, like you learn a couple of facts to get a job in life, sod off. You know, this isn't education. You're not taught to take an interest in the profundities, the miracles of life around you. That is not what is happening. And then with this alienated army of people, this alienated generations as it is now, they're cavemanly. I'm beginning to think it's the same across the Anglophone world. History of US education dumbed down by design. Yeah, you know, if you'd have asked me that 2-3 years ago, I'd have said, what nonsense. Now I'm not going to argue with you at all. Oh, God, he's putting it. John, you're doing it too quick. Right, caveman, it's been quite a marketing program in speech marks. Love of royalty, it parallels love of slavery. Oh, my God, you beat me to it. Yeah. It's this whole need to hold on to the naive. The monarchy, you know, I am better than you. Why? Because my ancestors were bigger crooks than yours. You know, no. You know, Karl Marx, Karl baby. You know, why is there the upper class? Because there were better horse thieves in those families than anybody else. You know, yeah. I mean, oh, do you know my? Right, I'll give you this quote before I hand back, John. My favourite quote by Karl Marx, by the way. Thank God I'm not a Marxist, which is my favourite quote by Karl Marx. And I wrote it in my notebook years ago, and I'm trying to find which book it comes in. I know it's one of the latter books. But no, we've got to get over this nonsense. We've got to get over this so-called noblesse oblige. We've got to get over this these royal so-called dynastic paranoias, the phobias. We've got to get, yeah, the whole thing is about, I can use you to my advantage and I will not be stopped. You can't stop me. That is what we're really facing here, not a cultural crisis of unprecedented orders. We're facing a political crisis amongst people who simply refuse to think there's anything like honesty, integrity, and authenticity in public life. Handing back.
Well, yeah, I mean, those of you that have been with us for some time are aware of my relationship with my best friend Douglas Gabriel and his wife Tyler Gabriel and their American Intelligence Media, in which over the years we've been able to dig up a great deal of primary evidence, stuff that would be suitable for use in a court case. And working in collaboration with Americans for Innovation, with Michael McKibben and his associates over there, it's 100% clear to us. And it is Vladimir Lenin was a creation of the elite Pilgrim Society while staying at the home of British MP Philip Whitewell Wilson. This project was further developed through the Empire Press Union, the New York Times, MI6, and the development of communism. Their self-appointed elitist creation to control the masses. So this is fully documented evidence that shows that the British American Pilgrim Society that was created in 1902 created the Bolshevik Revolution as a false flag color revolution to destabilize Russia so that the British American corporations would have control and access to Russia. I mean, we've been able to jot that down and say this is it. Of course, this was clearly looked at by Anthony Sutton, who did the deep dive, and his books are invaluable for somebody who actually wants to understand the history of things, because again, he worked with primary documentation also. And so he did books on the relationship of the corporations, the development of Nazi Germany, and a book on the relationship to development of the Soviet Union, and on and on and on, while he was at the Hoover Institution. And so there is that, and it's the same old, because you can go back to East India Company, and back when King George came to the Eureka moment, he realized it was expensive to maintain a standing army. Why don't we just have this mercenary approach of corporations? And the East India Company ended up having a larger military than the British Empire. And so we're still playing that song. It's become technological, and they're really digging deep to weaponize language so that they can utilize it for their purposes. And so Eureka, that's what we're looking at. And anybody has any depth of history, they wouldn't dare disagree with me on that.
Yeah, I mean, I stand by that fine British history of levellers and diggers and the Peasants' Revolt. These aren't new issues. I mean, the metaphysics behind it may have taken time to be revealed, and I'm certainly not criticising anyone in anthroposophy, any anthroposophist, with or without a capital A, with a clear eye to such things. It's just, I think processes take time, and all of these, I think us mere plebs felt uneasy for a very long time at this usurpation of power, and a clear usurpation, and the redefining of royal roles and prerogatives and aristocratic roles and prerogatives. And, it takes time, and, the history of criminality took a lot of time, a lot of years, many decades to unfold, many hundreds of years sometimes. A friend of mine from South Asia, not an area I know particularly well. My love is Central Asia. But from South Asia many years ago told me that one of their sayings was never trust the East India Company. which apparently is quite prevalent over there. What they didn't realise is there are analogues in this country about not trusting the East India Company. Yeah, I mean, greed, isn't it? That's really what we're discussing. What is truth? Truth is allowing the mind to have a clearer perspective of when human greed is at work and when it's not. Truth is not simply an empirical field of facts which are then checked one against each other, you know, whether something's heavy, whether something's light, whether something's far away, whether something's near. John?
Well, it gets difficult because ultimately when Jesus Christ says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, there's an implication there that is a moral impulse. And what we're seeing in the modern age through materialism is an amoral approach to truth that just by its own natural tendencies wants to be able to find answers to everything in the life of the senses. And anybody who's of any depth within spiritual understanding realizes that that's an incomplete picture of reality. You know, again, going back to what we've said off and on over these many episodes, is that whole idea of the open set and the closed set. And then when you're working with a closed set, say you're saying everything's caused by material phenomenon, that's closed set. Whereas somebody who is more spiritually inclined would want to see the world as an open set, meaning they could take all the sense data that they can achieve and it still wouldn't be enough without the input of the levels of soul and spirit. And so there we have it. And of course the materialists will say you're hallucinating, because when they think of things like that, that terrifies them, because they would like to think that they can find some kind of rational answer for everything. And it's tricky. And so basically the way it is if you're going to study the work of Rudolf Steiner, it's good to maintain a healthy suspension of disbelief, because you may get to the end of the page and you wonder what just happened, you know, because he's not structuring his ideas in a way that's entirely familiar with the average individual, so that you have to learn to be able to think in terms of that spirit and soul context. And that's the point of spiritual science, really. Whereas what we're seeing in the pop culture realm is that whole idea of the weaponizing of language for ulterior purposes. You know, like if you go back to the Grail story, they refer to in Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal, Parsifal is referred to as being without guile, and meaning he didn't have an agenda. He wasn't serving some kind of agenda. You know, he wasn't working for the East India Company or what have you. So that you have that whole idea of a purity of motive and arising at moral forces, but doing it without guile and doing it in freedom. And that is the distinction.
Gosh, again, you're saying so much, it's difficult to know where to come from. One of the books I loved reading, was it last year? Recently, was Spycatcher. What was it, Peter Wright? Margaret Thatcher had it banned in Britain. And I thought, well, okay. I mean, right, so we had it published in Australia. Ha, 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 ha. You know, I mean...
She was probably getting a kickback, you know, to help, because she helped boost sales by banning it.
Oh, that woman. I mean, it's hard. I don't like the modern habit of speaking ill of the dead. I'll just leave it with that woman. You know, did she meet certain needs in British politics? Yes, but at the unprecedented destruction of the things she claimed to be preserving. John.
They're all a mixed bag. I mean, come on, really.
Yeah, there are mixed bags, and there are mixed bags with an agenda. I was suspicious of her from the beginning. Any politician, after winning an election, that comes out of the doors of Number 10 and instantly quotes a saint makes me deeply suspicious. She came and quoted St. Francis, where there is war, let me bring peace. Well, love, you didn't do that, did you? Also, there was nearly civil war in this country under her reign, which people tend to forget. The miners' strike wasn't simply a couple of northerners getting uppity, and it wasn't simply a minor insurrection stirred up by Arthur Scargill, the great union leader of that time. No, they were having their livelihoods and their communities decimated, which some would argue, on this I don't know either way because I don't know enough of the facts, but as some would argue, deliberately so. Whole villages, towns, and one or two cities were reduced to being on their knees because of her policies. Some people thought she was doing that deliberately. And there were D-notices. The British press is not allowed to report this. We still have D-notices. On the level of conflict and insurrection, the level of near open civil war that was being fought in the north of this country. The police have never been militarized and had never been militarized until then. They were surrounding towns and villages sometimes, hundreds and hundreds of them, to lay siege to the people living therein. That's not British policing. That's what armies do. That's not what the police do. And, they were literally assaulting and assailing and breaking up meetings of people with a right to withdraw their labour. I am sounding like a communist. All those are facts. They can be checked. How did British people get to hear about it? Because we've got this terrible neighbour called France that doesn't like D-notices, that started the French Revolution. Vive la France! There we are. And therefore we all got it from them. We knew what was happening. But of course it was a clever trick because we get to hear a week or so too late to actually do anything. John?
Well, yeah, like here in the States during Vietnam War, everybody turn on Channel 9 because that was Canadian, and you were able to get more in-depth reporting on certain issues. It's all about the management of opinion, isn't it? And you go back to the research we did and being able to come up with, I have a copy here of the first Imperial Press Conference of 1909. It was where they all got together and they worked on putting in place the concept that with the coined phrase for it is government by journalism. And so that's something that W.T. Stead came up with. W.T. Stead being the most famous journalist in the UK at that time, in Britain at that time, actually. And that he was also the individual who introduced Annie Besant to Madame Blavatsky. I mean, this guy was all over the map. And he did some good things too, like he was the one who was the first one to establish an age of consent regarding children and sexual activities. And so you look at these things and it's always a mixed bag. You can look at somebody and think, well, that was good. They did this. Well, that was bad, or that was stupid. And you're dealing with people. In fact, if you get into that, what Rudolf Steiner says regarding the period of history that reflects the period we're in now, which is the Egypto-Chaldean period, because they were the same number of years before Christ as we are after Christ. So you could see that as in the continuum of time as being a reflection point. And he says that that's true in a very real sense. And if you look into the history of the Egyptian pharaohs, the establishment, and you go back to like the early writers on it, like Manetho or one of those sources, you'll see that they They refer to the early rulership of Egypt as being ruled by the gods. And by what they mean by that is gods, demigods, this whole idea that there were beings that were supersensible beings that were the ones that were guiding the civilization, and they were able to give instructions to the initiated priesthood, and that would give them the indications, taught them the arts of language and growing corn and building buildings and all these various aspects of culture. And you find, like I have, and like what I've told many times, is I did a relational database on ancient cultures of Egypt and Mesopotamia in excess of, well, thousands of volumes, 15,000, something like that. But I have my printout over here, actually, it's like this high. And so when you look into these sources and you see that all these ancient cultures, they tend to say the same thing, that this great leader came along and taught them how to do, all these things, growing food, language, architecture, all of that. But you get at a certain point in history that it comes in, like in Egypt, is referred to in Manetho as Menes, being the first human pharaoh, and which is interesting. And so you see that because you get that in more than one culture. You have Menes is like Manu, and Minos, and there's a great many examples of that particular word, and it ties into Manas, which is that principle, the fifth principle, which has a relationship to the cosmic thought element, right? So that you're looking at that, and that pertains to the realm of the angels. And so they were in communion with these angelic beings, and then they made their transition, and then it was, whereas really early in Egyptian history, the people as a whole would be able to see these great beings as the clairvoyant powers subsided, moving towards the turning point of time to where we lost clairvoyance through working with the brain thinking, that there was a priesthood that was the intermediary to receive these types of instructions. See, and so it behooves us to keep an open mind and try to understand the dilemma that we're in is largely a humanist problem, and that there's these people running around using abstract thinking and trying to find answers for everything by putting strictures on other things and just moving around furniture in the living room, so to speak, and thinking that they're going to fix the waves of karma or something like that. So it's quite a fascinating thing, because you get this whole development of the initiate kings. And Rudolf Steiner does make reference to that. In fact, he said that the Emperor Charles IV was the last initiate on the throne of the emperors.
Has there ever been a confluence of initiates and royals? Yes, I dare say there has. Is that the majority of royals? I doubt. I tend to look at the history of criminality as opposed to the history of clairvoyance when we're looking at so-called royal houses. And sadly, I'm never, ever lacking facts, never, ever lacking evidence in that particular thing. I mean, the point I mentioned, Spycatcher, was that it was common policy, according to him, in those days for MI5 to recruit young ladies of the upper classes to monitor the activities of the lower classes, because it was in the best interests of their class. And that's the sort of thing Margaret Thatcher didn't want read in this country, proving what a completely hypocritical person she was, because she was doing exactly the same. She was encouraging both MI5 and MI6 at that particular time to do the same thing. Use class divisions, and I'm against the whole class system anyway. Someone said to me years back, instead of culture, we British, have the caste system? Well, the answer to that is no, 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 no. What you're doing is minimizing the importance of culture for political expediency. We can't, sadly, in our present culture, separate the two. I really wish we could. And if anything, those things are getting worse. They're not getting better. Let's take it from a different angle, I suppose. James the First, yeah, I mean, wasn't he the one that, an incredible book, translation, his version of the Bible is the most beautiful. I use it primarily myself. I'm aware of the rigors of translation. I mean, some things simply don't work. I mean, all this mention of witchcraft in the King James Version. Well, right, the origin of the word witchcraft is Wicca in Anglo-Saxon English. They weren't using Anglo-Saxon English in that part of the world when the biblical texts were inscribed. Therefore, the word simply can't have been witchcraft. It's always politics edging in. I mean, the word seems to have been something like poisoner. Saying a poisoner, you shan't suffer, one second, John, thou shalt not suffer a poisoner to live, is very different from saying the old lady who's a bit dotty at the end of the street can be sacrificed because she's of no worth, or anyone that disagrees with you. We've got to remember the history of witchcraft tends to be people of a different ideology that don't agree with us, and we've got the police or the army on our side. Handing back, John.
Well, yeah, you have that. The Greek text is pharmakia, and so you have the whole idea, because as Paracelsus says, medicine is a controlled use of poison, and so that's pharmakia. And you go to an apothecary, and that's where, if some woman of whatever station in life decided that she was fed up with her husband, or vice versa, the husband could go, they could go down to the pharmakia and get whatever potion was needed to change the circumstance, shall we say. So you have that element, but there is this with the Salem witch trials, and there is all those things, and there's no question that there's this difficult cultural struggle in which all of what we're doing now has arisen from. I mean, if you go back to Charlemagne, as he's called here, and most people, and even in the Steely Dan song, it's Charlemagne, Kid Charlemagne, right? Charlemagne, and that the first Holy Roman Emperor, the attack that he had put onto the Anglo-Saxon opponents of his at that time is just devastating. And so there's this whole history of blood, and there is that. But you can go back, and there's these interesting periods, because, for example, if you go back to the reign of Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt, it's very key. And in fact, according to the report of Ernford Pfeiffer, the founder of biodynamic gardening, Rudolf Steiner had indicated that the great initiates, the masters of wisdom and feelings, that these great beings were all incarnated in the court of Queen Hatshepsut. And so that's quite fascinating. And when you get into who her counselor was Senenmut. And Senenmut, he had in his tomb, there was the first zodiacal ceiling ever to be seen in Egypt, and was actually copied later on by Seti I, and so who's the father of Ramses, right? And so you get this cosmic element. But you see that after Queen Hatshepsut, who had herself proclaimed king, by the way, after her reign, they scratched out a lot of the cartouches. Like there was another faction that didn't go along with the agenda that they were serving. But if you look closely at the reign of Hatshepsut, it was a time of expansion and trade. but just trade in the usual sense, not in the trade in the sense that you go in and you smite the people and establish it that way, but to actually get into a peaceful form of trade. It's a unique concept. But Senenmut was a commoner, and so he's the highest example of a commoner in all of Egyptian history. If you study it, you'd see that he was the most influential commoner, and that he was not of that particular royal bloodline, that ritual birth process that was so integral to the Egyptian dynastic developments. And so it's a fascinating page in history, and I cover it in my first book somewhat. And but you have that Senenmut being a Manu figure, again going back to the Manu name, the Menes, that whole idea of that there's a level of initiate that's beyond the great initiates, and that's that central figure. That's what's pointed at by the Manu, or even by Noah. That's that whole image of that great one, the teacher of teachers. But in getting into understanding the drama that we're going through now, Rudolf Steiner said that in the Egyptian the Egyptian period, Chaldean, and that whole area of the world, Mesopotamia, that it was a time in which the tutelage of mankind was taking place through the realm of the angels. And you have to get into more detail that, because the angels are not all the same. And then when you get into further detail where he's talking about the incarnation of Christ, and that Christ didn't just come from man and women. He came here, and it was a learning experience for the beings of the angelic hierarchies also, that there was that whole sense of newness and the presentation of that seed impulse that'll move into the future as the earth ultimately develops into a future sun. So it's really immeasurably profound when you try to look more closely at it. And you see that there are those angels that didn't understand it before, because they weren't a part of that prophetic stream leading up to the incarnation of Christ, but then realized it at the time and became in the company of the Christ impulse. And then there were those that negated the Christ impulse, and that now we're in a recapitulation period. And so we're at the tutelage of the angelic realm of the fallen angels, but also of the ones that were fallen but that have redeemed, and also the ones that were of the Christ stream initially. And so then you have the idea that the beings that had occupied the previous globe before Earth, that had graduated to angels, couldn't incarnate in human physical bodies. Only the retarded angels could, you see. So that these angelic beings that were guiding the early Egyptian developments were beings that had, under the will of God, accomplished the goal to become an angel in the previous planetary condition. And so that they didn't have that retarded impulse. And Rudolf Steiner makes the point is that the retarded impulse of Lucifer was ejected from the Jewish culture tradition of Jehovah. And so these are some of the most profound things that one can consider, because going beyond having an experience and describing it as a subjective mystic might, you realize that you can come to and grasp an understanding of the process of initiation, which is to not just have the experience, but to be able to understand the experience.
Well, at the risk of turning unfashionable, dare I say it's the Protestant mindset that likes reducing everything to an intellectual problem that can be solved. It's actually not the Catholic mindset or the Orthodox mindset. And there's a lot more to a mystery than a series of logical statements that can be verified. Look, my position on this is that the initiates are correct, no doubt, but we need to deepen what they're saying and not just simply take the aphorism, the paragraph at face value. I think, you know, when an initiate says something, right, then we have to go into what does that mean with the facts as we know them. Certainly, I've no doubt that the upper class like being seen as gods, no matter what period they're in. You know, and nowadays they all like being seen like lizards or something, isn't it? Well, I mean, and they're unstoppable, and they've got a super science behind them. And do you know they made the moon as well? No, Liz, love, take your crown off, get an honest job. No, 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 you're not a lizard. 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 You're a grasping parasite that wants to live off the labour of others. John, you are turning me into a communist, not a Marxist, a communist. No, I mean, right. Let me counterbalance what you said. I have no doubt that certain people have access to lofty states of consciousness in positions of power. I'm not sure. I think it's a dynasty or a family or anything like that. Why do I say that? Because I did religious studies, which was based on, in those days, the history of ideas. I think you'd call it religious studies nowadays. That's certainly what the qualifications is. You know, and I majored in Hinduism. And, you know, Hinduism is the ultimate caste system. If you are born into the lower castes and you have the mathematical capabilities of Einstein, but you come from a family of cobblers, it's much better that you should be a cobbler and not try and be Einstein. This is nonsense. This is nonsense, and it's got to stop. And, you know, the Brahmins are always telling everybody, we are here because we read the Veda. You are there because you don't. No, it's another way of saying they're all lizards or they're all gods. No. And what used to happen is sometimes a great guru, a Maha guru, would have the audacity to arise from the lower orders. I mean, the Sikhs will know who I mean, but it's not just them. A cobbler down the road, a wine cellar down the road would suddenly start experiencing Sat Chitananda and have access to cosmic consciousness and gather followers around him or her. The hers have been slowly erased from Indian history. You can plot who they were. There were women who claimed and did seem to have access to higher consciousness, higher potentials, and their names were either made into men's names with the turn of the centuries, or they were slowly erased from history, because that's inconvenient in a patriarchal caste system. But what used to happen was that the guy, right, maybe he was, you know, I don't know, something like a blacksmith or something. And then what the Brahmins would do was say, isn't it marvelous? Not only do the kings and queens, the rajas of our people, they're the chief gods, but their servants also incarnate into human history to show us the wisdom of the higher worlds. No, it was just a guy that doesn't fit into your system having access to knowledge you say can't be accessed unless you're born into that caste. No. An end to royals, an end to this royal privilege, an end to any type of book glorifying their wonderful beatific presence through history. It's all childish nonsense, and it's written for ideological purposes, and I don't accept a single word of it. Therefore, if Steiner is saying, as a case in point, and as an anthroposophist, obviously I don't think Steiner's wrong. I think what we've got to do is say, okay, right, a great initiate, a hugely gifted scholar has just said this. What does it mean if we unpack it in terms of what we know about human history, human culture, and the greed, ignorance, stupidity, and power that form so much of it? What do you think, John?
Well, again, I guess that's what keeps our conversations interesting, because you tend to want to stay contemporary in your frame of reference. And I'm continually talking about vast periods of time.
The example of the Hindus goes back at least 2,000 years.
Yeah, well, it goes back before that. I mean, the Vedas are according to Rudolf Steiner, much later written down, somewhat watered down version of the revelations that came forth. It was like, you're going back like between 8 and 10,000 BC, where you're getting the primal Manu culture, so that, and you have the Manu leading the migration from Atlantis, and there's the northern migration stream that goes across Europe into Central Asia, and then you have the southern stream that came across through the Mediterranean, across northern Africa, and crossing into eventually connecting with that primal civilization center in Central Asia that Rudolf Steiner makes reference to, that Blavatsky makes reference to, and that whole mythic image of Shambhala or Shangri-La as being the repository of wisdom. But to look at that today, the correct thing to do would, in light of spiritual science, is to see Shambhala as a state of being, a state of consciousness at which these great beings dwell. And so you just can't mess around when it comes terms to initiates and beings that are referred to as masters, because you have beings that are in advance of mankind. They're experiencing our future states of potential being, and they're having that at the current time. And so you get examples of that, like the Comte de Saint-Germain, for example. You could just, the sheer amount of amazing reporting on his career through Europe, that there's so many things he did, and certain things that he did that were supernatural, like he could write a letter simultaneously with both hands, and then he could take the two letters and hold them up to a light and see that it perfectly superimposed. Now, what would be the value in having that as a skill set? You could question the the value of that, but nonetheless, it's definitely not normal. I know I can't do that. And so you have these inklings of beings that are way in excess of ordinary mankind. And, so suspend disbelief, don't worry about it. What I like to say to people, you have the Lord's Prayer, you have the first 14 verses of the Gospel of John, and you have, if you need the more extended version, the 6,000 lectures of Rudolf Steiner and the 50 published books, that you can explore it as much as you like. But keep in mind, if one has the opportunity in this incarnation to be able to approach spiritual science, it behooves oneself to actually do it. Because in your next incarnation, you may incarnate somewhere where that's not available to you. So if you have any interest in it, you might want to check it out while you can.
Gosh, I mean, yeah, we need to deepen our knowledge of spiritual science. I mean, the end. I mean, the ultimate rubric. Oh God, there was something that was at the back of my mind before all that. Something to do with spy catcher. I mean, yeah. I think we've all got to just. There's a mystical mindset, there's an occult mindset, and then there's, which is meant to be against the empirical mindset. I've never actually seen that. I don't see them as an either or, and certainly Saint-Germain. I mean, I can't work out why that would be, how that would be something useful, but I can, as a demonstration of the fact that people can work in supernormal ways at least, that strikes me as very powerful. Now, what worries me is the sort of elitism of knowledge, which isn't what our ancestors had in the past. They would have, their cultures were different. Not everyone had access to knowledge, because if you were in the 1400s and working as a farmer, that was your life. You would not have had the time or the luxury, or indeed the education, to look at written text such as it was. and written text was very minimal because of the price of paper and the sheer scarcity of scribes. No, I mean, so, it's not an either or. Nowadays, it is becoming esoteric in the wrong sense. And it's an either or, that was it. We touched upon the so-called academy, that, those imposters that use that word nowadays, that are trying to reduce everything, it strikes me, and you, I think, as well, into sort of one set of empiricisms. And they want really other types of interpretation to just go away. And be silenced. I mean, it's not that they're not active in that particular field. They are trying to silence other types of voice and other types of intellect. A Brazilian friend of mine who went on to all sorts of heights, I knew a couple of years ago, said to me face to face, "Your type of intellect has left the academy." And I thought, gosh, well, at least it's honest. There is, but we've got to look at the historical origins of all of that. It was the philosophes in France that wanted everything to stand on the basis of the natural sciences. Their argument, and they weren't atheists, they were deists. They did believe there was a divine principle. They didn't want to say you could say much about it, for the simple reason they were trying to stop wars of religion from ever recurring. That was one of the reasons. Therefore, if you base your primary assumptions on a religion, okay, which one should it be? Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox? I mean, they wouldn't have said what I'm just about to say, but let's extend it. Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, where do we stop? Which one are we going to use as the basis? Is it incontrovertible? Are we all going to accept, yes, they offer a series of axioms that we'll all argue from? And the answer is clearly no. So what the philosophers were trying to do as deists, and that tradition shouldn't be dispelled so easily. I mean, at least they believed in something, unlike most moderns in the academy and in politics. And they were trying to work for the good of humankind, which certainly can't be said about those institutions. And some of the big moralists of their time, the moral giants of their time, wrote from that perspective. It interests me that the academy is now trying to suggest, hint, 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 that they were all atheists. I mean, they all write about it. There's not the slightest possibility that they were atheists in disguise. They all write about it. But, push, push, push. Let's make everyone atheistic. Push, push, push. No. So, where did they feel was the only base from which you could really start interconnecting with each other, with, between societies and between individuals, the natural sciences, because at least that offered us some form of certainty. And they, people like Diderot wouldn't have gone beyond that. Some form of certainty, not complete certainty. That is being twisted. I mean, I nearly said it a minute ago, by modern academia into meaning something that simply wasn't meant at the time. What they weren't aiming at was the diminution of human discourse into something basically purely materialistic. That wouldn't have crossed their minds. And in fact, some of them wrote against that. And I'm one of my great heroes is David Hume, a very misunderstood man in all sorts of ways. One of the leading lights of the Scottish Enlightenment. I remember reading him at university. I hadn't read him before. I probably wouldn't have read him unless I'd have gone and done the course. And I came out of that experience genuinely enlightened and confused. How can a man of his obvious intelligence want to attack so much? And then it suddenly struck me, God, Scottish Calvinism. It's really as simple as that. How can you lot be so bloody certain? That's what's behind it all. And that's good, and that's right, and that's proper. The minute you get a priesthood of any description, including the rationalist priesthood, so-called, that claims to hold all knowledge at the moment, the minute they're not challenged, problems start. And you end back in the Middle Ages where anybody with a different point is a heretic and you will be killed because we've got hegemony and we intend to keep it. What do you think, John? Are you a fan of David Hume, the greatest atheist, if that's what he was? Because I think the court's still out on that one, that Scotland didn't produce.
Yeah, except that I haven't read any David Hume in 40 years, but a point well taken, that whole idea of the backdrop of Calvinism, and its critical place in the Council of Trent, which was the ultimate negotiation to draw to a close the 40 Years' War, but there was 3 different sessions, and the third one was dominated by the Jesuits. And so you see in the Council of Trent kind of cliff notes to a future destiny, so to speak, and that's that whole superstructure of legalism that we're living under. It's a marriage of legalism with the whole concept of commerce. And so you have commercial interests that are determining the content of cultural impulses. And that's what we're having. It's because a certain company happens to advertise on that station, so therefore that station's not going to say anything bad about that sponsor. And so you have that corrupting of the public square, that you have that whole idea that more money is more powerful. And it's this whole, again, the East India Company thing. It's these things are allowed but not permitted. It's like, it gets a little bit dicey, shall we say. Well, that being said, before I forget, I should remind you that the wonderful writings of Reverend David Parry are available on eBay. Here's The Grammar of Witchcraft, which is a wonderful Shakespearean study. And then you have his Shakespearean-esque poetry, Caliban's Redemption. And the primary volume is Mount Athos Inside Me, Essays on Religion, Swedenborg and the Arts, edited by the very talented Daniele-Hadi Irandoost. And that's a wonderful work. And speaking of Daniele-Hadi Irandoost, he has his book, Philosophy of Education Towards an Anthroposophical View. It's a very courageous effort to attempt to take other schools of thought and try and figure out what is the relationship between them and the kind of thinking that is behind Waldorf education that began with Rudolf Steiner. All those books are available on Amazon. There's links below that you can click on to get you there. You can get a free digital version of Daniela's book. But if you like paper copies like I do, you can get them there. And for myself, I'm the author of 2 books: The Arcana of the Grail Angel, The Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the underground streams of esoteric Christianity which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the True Rosicrucian Order, with a foreword by my best buddy Douglas Gabriel, with extensive diagrams and bibliography. And that's 640 pages. Here's my thinner volume, more of a meditative tool, The Arcana of Light on the Path, with a foreword by the noted Strasbourg psychologist William Bento, the late Willie. And but in here is included all of the full series of Grail diagrams that are based on the watercolor handwritten diagrams that crossed my desk many, many years ago. And I cribbed notes from that. And then I created a great many more. There's way more diagrams in the second book because I continued thematically to develop the project further. My books are available on eBay. directly from me, or you can contact me directly if you're outside the continental US. You can contact me through Facebook Messenger or through my academia link below. And at the academia link, you can download the foreword by William Bento for free. And so those are all available for you. And if you want to, you can buy us a cup of coffee. For Reverend David, paypal.me/dperry777. And for myself, paypal.me/John Barnwell 888. And of course, I want to give a shout out, shall we say, to people that have been helpful over time. And I'm trying to figure out what I did with them. Here they are. Oh. I try to get all this organized, but it really is a lot. Did it close on me? I believe it closed on me. Well, that's okay. I will find it anyways, because I have it here. Humor me for a second while I open this up. Yes, here we go. So that this podcast has been made possible by the generous support of Tyler, Vadim, Vivian, Neil, Christian, Mark, Maud, Druvman, Laura, Paula, Rick, Michael, Beth, Ishtar, Anna, and so many others over the years. We want to thank you all for supporting our humble efforts. So to continue on, in that lecture cycle, the spiritual guidance of the individual and humanity, some results of the spiritual research into the human history and development. And one of those lengthy titles that they seem to come up with. It's in the Collected Works, volume 15. But in there it says, in the New Testament, it is put thus: unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. That's Matthew 18, verse 3. What then seems to be the highest ideal for a human being if the above statement is correctly understood? Surely that our ideal must be to approach ever closer a conscious relationship with the forces that worked on us without our awareness in the first years of childhood. At the same time, we must realize that we would collapse under the power of these forces if they were immediately and too easily to affect our conscious life. That is why a careful preparation is necessary to achieve the capacities that lead to a perception of supersensible worlds. The goal of this preparation is to enable us to bear what we simply cannot bear in ordinary life. And that's in chapter 1. And so you see, hearkening back to what we were discussing earlier, that is the quest of the Grail. It's the fashioning of the ability to receive, to create a Grail heart, so to speak, that it becomes actual expression of the divine spiritual forces that will be leading us into the future. And of course, from the vantage point of spiritual science, is very real. And according to the mechanistic materialism, for the most part, is considered to be just some kind of phantasmagorical illusion. And so, but again, all we're asking is that you suspend disbelief and attempt to enter into the ideas and see if you can actually understand what Rudolf Steiner means himself.
Right. Two things. I don't think it's simply, excuse me, a question of suspending disbelief. There are a number of denuded descriptions of life at the moment. The scientific one, the scientific materialist description, is denuded. You're looking at a slightly more accurate but less effective and general description of life, which leaves out far too much, or a more messy and slightly more abstruse, dare I say, abstract view of life, which includes more, but it isn't as clear and is more messy. But we've got to admit the latter is more true to our experience as human beings. It's not simply a question of, has this guy got something to say? Give him a chance, give him a break. It's also that if you really believe the increasingly narrow series of discourses being offered to us as complete descriptions of human life, then surely you have to admit, whoever you are, there's something missing, and that hasn't really described you or your experience of the world or that of the people you know. And also, if you don't do meditation, start meditation, because that answers everything sooner or later. Gosh, again, you've said so much. I don't know where to begin. Anthroposophy, it strikes me, isn't simply a collection of texts, although it is that, and let's hear it for the texts. It's also shared and gathered and collected experiences from across the globe, from across the world, from our family, our friends, and ourselves, that sometimes we simply don't want to admit is there and is true, but it is there and it is true. For me, the call to an anthroposophical view is life itself. If you're not satisfied with a superficial, rather arrogant view of life, and that's the one being fostered on everybody at the moment, I still think the dark powers aren't after you and me, John. I think they're after the babies. I think they're after those that don't know how to fight back, which distresses me no end. Because how do we reach out to them? You know what? I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but culture wars are where the struggle is at the minute, but not in the way people think it is. And one of the successful ones on behalf of this increasingly ruthless elite class, the gender war strikes me to be working. And also, the generational war. I mean, they seem to be getting somewhere with that now. Don't listen to those old codgers. They've got nothing to say. That's old school. Just go and jive around at festivals and listen to bland music that never actually raises your spirits, and take drugs. And that's what it's all about. That's being young. And that sadly strikes me as a war that's beginning to gain momentum. So what do you think of that, John, before I think we start to round off?
Well, yes. I mean, there's a long history of that kind of social engineering. I mean, Tavistock comes to mind. And so you have that. And that was covered wonderfully in so many places. We could do an exploration in that direction sometime, perhaps. But you trigger so many things that we have to kind of rein it in at times and figure out what it is we're actually talking about, especially when we're running out of time. And so, again, this ability to be able to include within your purview that method that allows you to participate in the life of soul and spirit. That's really what the thrust is of what we're trying to share with you here. And just in all humility, all I've merely done is occupied my time and energy with trying to figure that one out for the last 50 years or so, and David, I'm sure, although he's younger than I am, but that being said, it would be, did I leave something out? I'm trying to remember. I usually do leave something out, but that's okay. There's always more to get to. And so usually around this time, I deferred Reverend David to share some form of prayer to try and consecrate this wonderful gathering that we hear. And I want to thank everybody for showing up and on the good ship, What is Truth? And so back to you.
By the way, I'm getting myself off the hook. Free church isn't Protestantism. So my friends in our little church, isn't it wonderful, our little community? All of you know I've got heavy Gnostic tendencies. So I've just been handed this as a prayer I wanted to say with all of you today. It's called Hail Sophia. Hail Sophia, full of light, the Christ is with thee. Blessed art thou among all the aeons, and blessed is the liberator of thy light, Jesus. Holy Sophia, mother of all gods, pray to the light for us, thy children, now and in the hour of our death. Amen. Why is it important that we keep a religious, an Abrahamic perspective on faith? In India, human equality is not assumed. If I'm taking public transport and there's a Brahmin the other side of the bus, he is superior to me, the end. That has never been the Judeo-Christian experience. We are all equal and we're all sons and daughters of the Most High. That is why that's an important perspective. And that is something that needs to occupy us in the days until we all meet again next week. Amen.
Amen. And I want to thank everybody for sharing this time with us. And I hope that you have a good week. And next week, what will be at half hour later to start, correct? Yes, at 12:30 or 5:30. Yeah, that would be next week. Okay. So
I'll double check, John. I don't think so. We're with Doris. I'll message you. Yeah.
It doesn't really matter. They'll find us.